Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Paganism.
Here we go.
It's everywhere.
4 flavors.
4 flavors. Well, before we get to the 4 flavors, let me tell you a story about 2 people I know. And I'm going to call them Jack and Jill because I'm creative.
Well, I have deep questions about why Jack and Jill were going up the hill to fetch a pail of water. The whole thing seems hydrologically out of order for me. Like usually you go downhill to find water, but anyway.
Hydrologically out of order. I love it. All right. Well, these 2 were not going to fetch water. So Jack is an acquaintance. These are real people, of course. You know, I'm just disguised their identities. Jack is an acquaintance. Jill is a friend of mine. So Jack is an acquaintance. You know, knew him for a little while, was, you know, worked for a missions organization for a while here and very involved in his church. And, you know, we both run in the same circles, PCA circles. So, but, you know, as happens, Jack just kind of, you know, we lose touch, falls off my, you know, radar and he's gone for a long time. Well, then, you know, as happens, right, Jack shows up in my social media feed. Oh, Jack, haven't seen this guy in a while. So, you know, I'm looking at him and I'm watching this reel. And then suddenly I'm thinking, what is going on? Jack is talking about how he's talking about his pack of tarot cards. And he's saying, you know, these things go with me everywhere I go. And, you know, so then, of course, I do what any person would do. I indulge in some good old fashioned or new fashioned online stalking.
Yeah. Let's call it what it is.
It turns out that, yeah, let's go. It turns out that, you know, Jack has at some point crossed the Rubicon from Christianity into paganism. So, all right, so let's leave Jack for a second. Then, you know, Jill and I are friends in high school, you know, lost touch with her as one does with high school friends. And so then where does she show up again? Well, in my social media feed. Now, Jill doesn't have tarot cards, but she's talking a lot about chakras on the body, and she is practicing aerial yoga.
Aerial yoga.
You ever heard of aerial?
No, this is
aerial. Yep.
Leave it up to Americans to keep
adding
adding new types of yoga to the Hindu religion. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. Right. So she's doing this, and while she's doing these very intricate stretches and maneuvers while suspended from the ceiling. So working on working on all of that. Anyway, she has at some point crossed the Rubicon from, now she grew up, you know, with a Catholic background and was nominal for a while, then had a point of crisis, took it more seriously, but then has at some point left that Catholic heritage well behind and left it for pagan territory as well. So those are just those are 2 personal anecdotes about our changing landscape. Let me throw some numbers at you real quickly for the data people. Nathan's one of the data people, but the data actually are still a little bit sparse on paganism in the U.S. and it's not quite clear. It's not entirely clear to me why that is, but I think these are relatively new forms of, you know, study, right? Because this was just paganism was not a major contender for most, you know, for many years. It was a real outlier, and that's changed dramatically in recent years. So the data I'm pulling from, I think these studies were 2018. So at the time,
that's a while ago now. Though, really, I mean, 6 years a lot.
It's a while ago now. Yeah. So, and I tried to, but people are still citing this today. In 2023, articles are still citing this study. But at the time, one estimate put the number of practicing witches in America at 1.5 million. And just to put that number into perspective, my denomination, the PCA, at the time had 1.4 million members. So
yeah, you've been outwitched.
Practicing witches were outpacing. Yes, we've been outwitched. And so I also, by the way, I think it's safe to say that here in 2024, I would put the number of practicing witches. I would say it's a safe guess to say that it's much higher now, probably, than 1.5 million. Because I mean, there has just been a veritable surge in pagan practices. So I'm bringing that in just to paint the scene and say that this is what people mean when they say what we're dealing with paganism on a massive scale right now in the US. And so how do we sort of prepare for that as Christians? I'm just giving a little, taking the temperature, so to speak.
You don't sound terribly concerned though.
Well, and I mean I am concerned. I think this is just, well, we'll talk about definitions here in a second because that's going to be very important. I am concerned, but I think part of this is going to be an outworking of if you move away from Christianity, or if you disavow traditional, your traditional heritage, spiritual heritage, human beings are still spiritual creatures, and so that impulse, that hunger, something, we're gonna work to fill that in some way, and now we're doing paganism in a very unique way today. This doesn't look the way it did in ancient times. So I have to bring in the definitions to talk about that part.
Yeah, because which is which, as someone once said.
Which is which? There you go. And we've talked about this before on Thinking Out Loud. I think years ago
we talked about neo-paganism. But there's some other wrinkles,
and we talked about witches once too.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So if you're new to the podcast, go back and look for witches and neo-paganism somewhere back in the archives. You can find it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, back then when I followed several witch accounts on Instagram to do a little bit of
witch talk. That's the new.
I've since unfollowed them. Yeah, right. Sorry to those witch influencers, but I think I learned some stuff there. So there are, but when we say pagan, what do we mean? So there are four major senses of this word, only two of which I think really demand our close focus these days. But so the first sense of paganism just refers to the polytheistic religions of ancient Greece and Rome. So in that sense, you would describe the Odyssey as a pagan work of art, or the Iliad, or when we're talking about Rome, Virgil's the Aeneid. I think a lot of people, some cultured people would say, yes, that's a type of paganism that nobody could ever achieve nowadays, because it's very ruthless and it's very brutal, but there's an undeniable nobility to it, and there's a real courage to it. There's a severe kind of beauty to it as well. So, but when we look at, so if we're considering paganism today, I don't think there are many people who still are committed to the ancient pantheon. And if there are, there's a very small number, and they're pretty weird. So
so that's what I was wondering about.
That. We study that.
Do you meet many devotees to Zeus these days? It doesn't seem like that's part of the trend.
No. And again, so I don't think we need to worry about that.
Is there a so I think also you hear people say, well, pagan back in that time kind of meant like rural or countryside, or was that part of this definition, or did that just point to the proliferation outside kind of the normal epicenters of culture, that you kind of have your urban proper worship or reverence of the emperor, but then when you get out into the countryside, there's a less structured and non-governmentally controlled expressions of spirituality that manifest themselves in kind of in that sense of pagan, of just the diversity of spiritual expression and experience that happened out in the hinterland. Is that rural urban divide connotation, does that fit into this part of that definition of paganism? Or is that not even a real way that paganism
probably
used?
No, probably to an extent. I think that's in some ways that just describes the human religious scene across cultures. The types of religious devotion differ, of course, nowadays than they did back then. But I think you would have those similar divides between the educated elites and then those who were more primitive, perhaps, in their worship practices.
When Jesus is talking in Matthew about not worrying about what you'll eat and what you'll wear, and he says, for the pagans run after these things, is this the sense of
Mhm.
paganism that you're referring to? Is that the definition of paganism that Jesus is using there? Do you think
Yeah, well,
that polytheistic?
so well, that yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the intricate system of appeasement, sacrificial appeasement, and all of that obtained for a lot of these people, yes, because I mean, if you study any of these ancient pagan religions, you'll note very intricate sacrificial systems, and those are not just
Mhm.
there for the aesthetics of sacrifice. They serve or even we tend to we gather up some of those ancient artifacts and religious artifacts, and for us, oh, these are works of art. We're going to put it in a museum and look at it and stare at it. That would have been utterly foreign to these people. All of these things were tools. They had a very specific use. Yeah, this thing is going to get us some rain for our crops, and we're going to kill
Yep.
this guy, so that we don't face retribution here. And you even see that in the stories of ancient Greece, by the way. So that's part of it. I think another way to look at that elite working class divide would be Acts 14 versus Acts 17.
Hmm.
So in Acts 17, Paul is at the Areopagus, and it's all the cultural elites of the day, the philosophers and the poets. In Acts 14 in Lystra, they're dealing with people who are more working class. This is and that's the I'm using that term from commentaries that try to
Mhm.
put into our parlance what's going on there. And then
The
they, because
silversmiths.
remember Paul and
Yeah.
right, and Paul, yeah, and Paul and his their companion are walking through
Barnabas.
there. They
Yeah.
call Paul, I think, Hermes, because he keeps talking, and so they think he's the interpreter, the messenger. But they try to start worshiping them when they heal a person,
Yeah.
which makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, and by the way, I just think it's important to point this out. We do the same thing nowadays. If we see, if you better believe, if you saw a person, if some person was able to, in a mass televised event, I mean, well, we already have televangelists who claim to do this stuff and they're total frauds and phonies and they don't actually do it. But if you actually saw somebody put their hands on someone and real healing of an illness took place, people still want
Yeah.
to worship that
You would say the
person
gods are among us.
and
Yeah.
make them a god. And
Mm.
yeah, absolutely. And what do we do with celebrities and actors? So I mean, it's easy to look at that and say, oh, look at these primitive people. That human nature hasn't changed. We're still doing that. We just use different words sometimes. We might call somebody a
Mm.
star, right? What would you do if Taylor Swift walked by you? You know what I mean? So, but
Give her
but I mean,
directions, because she is
but
lost.
the so right. And so what Paul does in Acts 17 is he quotes poets. But what he does in Acts 14 is he talks about the natural cycles of rain and crops for his audience. So he adapts his message to both of them right there. So there's
Mhm.
that little divide. But I
All right.
digest.
So
Just
are you
kidding.
calling this paganism round
So
one?
that
Is this
yeah,
is this all one definition?
that's paganism round one. Yeah. It's mostly a subject of ancient history, and we study it and we learn from it, but we're not dealing with it as a serious system of belief.
Okay.
Okay, the second is an archaic use of the word, which is now offensive to us today. But paganism, by this sense, would mean that anything outside of Christianity. So anything outside the church qualifies as pagan. So in this
So
sense,
is
and
this
you'll see
like
this in
medieval era?
yes,
Okay.
Middle Ages, but probably
S-
even up to stuff written in the 1800s. I think was still using paganism in this sense. So in that sense, Muslim, Islam, Hinduism would qualify as pagan, and I think you can find some works in which, I mean, even C.S. Lewis occasionally refers to Muslims as Mohammedans, which that's also considered offensive these
Mhm.
days. And you have writers in the 1800s, I think, calling Muslims pagans, or saying the pagans in India. So that's an outdated
Mhm.
sense of that word. So we don't need to deal with that either. So that's the
Okay.
second
So that is
sense.
paganism as
It's
not
three and
Christian.
four. Yeah, paganism is not Christian. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Number
So
three.
paganism sense 3 and 4 are the ones that we need to focus on, I think. Yeah,
Wait,
especially
hang on.
3, because we've talked about 4 before.
Wait.
Yeah.
Is
Uh-oh.
is there is there a 2.5 in that when you
Hmm.
look at um let me take your integers and monkey with them. When you look at the self-identification of witches in the United States, let's put it that way, or self-identified
Sure.
pagans, is there a percentage of that group who is using paganism to mean not part of an official organized religion? So
Sure.
is that
I
definition
think
too
so. Yeah.
being picked back up as a badge of honor to say I'm spiritual but not religious?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So
I don't know.
anyway,
That seems
it's
speculative. But yeah, I mean, sure. I think when we get to the fourth one, we'll talk about that a little bit.
okay.
But definitely spiritual but not religious is a huge badge of honor, I think, in
Okay.
this category. Yes. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. So
Also
number
why it
three.
makes it hard to study these, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3, and this one I think is some people are going to find this one strange. I did not. This is not unique to Cameron. I didn't come up with this, but I think it's right. But this sense of paganism is paganism in the irreligious sense or hedonistic. So think about a phrase like, "Oh, look at I can't go into that nightclub with all those pagans," or
Mm-hmm.
obviously that sounds quite offensive. But
So this is where we would
let's
use
press into this one for
historically
a second.
heathen would have been used then, right? So is this the category where
Correct? Yes.
Okay, gotcha. So all right,
Yeah. Why do the heathen rage? Well, because they're in a nightclub. So I'm just kidding.
why did the heathen rave? That's the
let me. Rave. There you go. Oh man, I missed.
see what I did there.
Good.
You see
Well,
what I
well
did there?
played, sir.
Okay, thank you.
I see what you did there.
This is serious.
All right, let's
Number
drill into this one for a second because it might sound a little. Yeah, it's fair. Let's get very serious because it might sound strange at first. So I think most people will recognize on an intuitive level that pagan in the irreligious sense can't be the same thing as a doctrinaire materialist or scientific naturalist or somebody who's a very committed atheist. So, for instance, Nathan, I don't think it would sound right to most people if you said, well, look at Professor Richard Dawkins. He is a pagan.
Right.
It just
Yeah.
sounds funny. It doesn't sound accurate. It's not quite right. So, yeah, we need to make a meaningful distinction here. So, before I venture a definition, I want to give you 2 quotes. Just do a little compare and contrast, set them side by side, and because I think they illustrate the difference between these 2 sensibilities. So the first quote is Richard Dawkins, and it's likely very familiar to listeners. This is probably one of the most famous things he says. But so this is, and I quote, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." Okay, so that's Richard Dawkins. The second quote, I'm going to censor it just a little bit, and you'll know why when I tell you the name. Second quote is comedic actor Seth Rogen. He said this in a recent interview, and it's gone kind of viral, and there is a chance some of you have heard this as well. But here's what he says. "I don't know anyone who gets as much happiness out of their kids as we get out of our non-kids." Somebody should tell them non-kids isn't a word, but anyway. Like, we're psyched all the time. We're laying in bed on Saturday morning, smoking weed, watching movies, naked. If we had kids, we could not be doing this. End quote. So Seth Rogen is a pagan in that third sense. He's irreligious, but he is. So what's the key distinguishing factor, I think, if we just take these 2 quotes? I think the key distinguishing factor between him and Professor Richard Dawkins is that Dawkins, for all of his, hatred of religion and especially Christianity, is committed to a pursuit of the truth, even if it takes him to some dire conclusions. Seth Rogen is apparently committed to nothing more than a pursuit of pleasure, ease, and convenience. And I think so. I think in that quote, by the way, you have him giving voice to a central ambition of many Americans, and that is to grow up to be a teenager.
Right.
Now, so let's, I'll
boast
give you
about how incredibly naive you are. But, other than that.
Right. So So paganism in the irreligious sense, here's my stab at a definition. And again, take this with a grain of salt, because this is Cameron here. But so it's virtually synonymous with hedonism. Irreligious paganism is devoted to pleasure, a focus on one's immediate circumstances, and a resistance to God and organized religion based not on principle, but rather as a matter of convenience. So like he thinks he thinks kids pose a threat to your lifestyle. Just
yeah, what would a God do to his world?
Christ.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right. The infinite God who made you. Yeah.
Would be an impertinence to his dignity.
I mean, I think
yes.
Nathan, right. Well, Nathan, I think the first time I read that quote to you, you said, yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what the end of the life looks like, because there's no way that relationship survives. And they both will, if they're lucky, both perish alone in nursing homes where people don't care about them and no one will visit them. So there is a sad end game to that.
I should have a separate doom and gloom podcast.
So this is right. Well, I mean, that's a doom and gloom quote right there. I actually find that so I may have sounded blasé earlier, Nathan. I find that incredibly distressing to read. I think everything about that quote is deeply tragic, and also I find it quite horrifying as well.
Hang on. So this is interesting though, Cameron, because you find that way more disturbing than you found Dawkins' quote.
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm. That is weird, isn't it? Yeah, because you could look at the Dawkins quote and say, well, this is a picture of us being cosmic orphans. Well, Dawkins' quote has the other one is honesty.
Yeah, but so Dawkins sounds like you're a cosmic orphan. Seth Rogen sounds like you're a god. One of those is a bigger.
Yes.
One of those is a competitor to what you believe, and one isn't.
And one of them's a bigger delusion than the other. Dawkins is closer to the truth.
Yeah,
because he actually cares about the truth. You know, well, who's closer to the truth? The person who says we live in a blind, you know, I've studied the universe just as it is. I've restricted my gaze only to natural processes, and I've concluded that there is at bottom no purpose and no design. Who's closer to the truth? That person or the person who says I'm a god? And I don't want children are an impertinence and an inconvenience.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, yeah. Well, yeah. But I mean, and yeah, non-kids. Oh, hideous phrase. Yeah, non-kids are superior to kids. I mean, Seth? How do you think you were born, buddy? How do you think the human race perpetuates itself? I mean,
how would you know?
This reads like
you know.
Well, I mean, so on the one hand, it reads like I'm a god. On the other hand, it reads like a suicide note of civilization. That's what I mean. There are so many factors but this is he's speaking for huge numbers of people. I think this is a much bigger category of paganism, by the way, than practicing witches. And I'll go ahead and say it. I think practicing witches are closer to the truth than Seth Rogen is here.
Oh yeah, I'm with you on that. So well, give us definition 4 there, because we need this to continue our conversation. Yeah.
And then we can riff on that. We do. Definition 4 is what you're probably thinking when you hear paganism nowadays. It's what most people mean, I think, and that would be neo-paganism, and it's hard to get a grasp of it because, first of all, it resists being analyzed. By the way, I'll say a little bit about that in a second. It has to do with what you were talking about earlier when it comes to disaffiliation with any kind of organized religion. And it just includes a constellation of practices. So neo-paganism, all of these practices, the thread running through them, they center on nature worship. So that's one way to kind of get your head straight on this. But it can include everything from Wicca, which is a relatively recent religious movement. It can include astrology. It can include tarot cards. It can include New Age practices. It can include occultism of various kinds. It can include witchcraft. On and on we go. The thread running through this stuff is nature worship, but it's a huge constellation of practices. And most of them are very resistant to any kind of formalized or systematic expression. I mean, there's a reason. If you've ever looked into the history of the occult or just the occult in general, you'll know that a big part of it is a word to describe it is esoteric, and it's deliberately cryptic. It's deliberately secretive. It's deliberately resistant to kind of scientific approaches, or like the notion of us, we have systematic theologies. I mean, that would be utterly foreign to kind of, to most approaches to the occult. There are some, obviously there are some intricate systems, especially if you think about astrology and all of that, but it's kind of, it's in a different sort of category. I hope that makes sense. Probably doesn't.
Here's a weird feature for neo-paganism for me, that or subcategory, is that neo-paganism seems to have developed around some similarities to paganism definition 1, where you are so deeply dependent on nature that you develop superstitions and ideologies around, like, if you don't get this right, bad things happen in your life. And so there's that's the interesting thing of neo-paganism, is it's so disconnected from nature while worshiping it, where paganism version 1, I'm thinking of, like, even so I live in the mountains of West Virginia, and there's like folk religion that, if you like, people planting by the signs to all sorts of astrology, but then like very, very specific, like, I don't see anybody online talking about, like, your sauerkraut won't turn out correctly depending on where you're at in your menstrual cycle when you make it, or your salt rising bread not working because like, but that whole category of, like, old wives' tales and stuff that Paul talks about is alive and well, even among people who wouldn't, like, be getting a tattoo of a pentagram and sacrificing a cat, there's that whole subgenre of, like, getting your seeds planted at the right time, or the heart, like, that is very dependent upon nature. And neo-paganism doesn't, it's kind of like ripping off half, like, what they think are the fun parts of version 1 and then applying them to YouTube instead of to their sauerkraut production. I don't know. So I could be more cynical about it all, but
because
just point that out as we fly by.
Well, you can't go back. That's one of the reasons why you don't have anybody seriously worshiping Zeus and Athena. And if they are seriously worshiping Zeus and Athena, you should be worried about that person. If that's you, you should be worried. Get help. But they also, in the ancient world, they didn't have a weather app. You know what I mean? They didn't have thermometers. They didn't have penicillin.
Oh, right, yeah.
They didn't. We're modern people, so we can't go back. So that's why there's something very different about the paganism of our own day, even if they are taking a leaf from some of those ancients, and when they look at the cycle of nature, most people who have, are committed to some form of nature worship. Right. They may be into homeopathic cures and all that. They still pop an aspirin probably when they have a headache, and they probably still use modern sanitation products and and have indoor plumbing and all of that. So it's
definitely birth control.
Definitely birth control. You can't unsee it. You can't unsee all of that. So what we have happening now, this is where I do take a bit of a cynical view on this, Nathan, actually, because when I look at the reading I've done on this, and even a book like Strange Rites, RITES, which is a helpful kind of guide to some of these modern practices, what you're going to see in there is that this is very much paganism 2.0. It's carefully customized to fit the preferences of the user. Something that is not even remotely true of ancient pagans, for whom this was a matter of life and death. And
so
and there was that's not the case now. Yeah.
Let's push into this, because up until this point, it could sound like we're being a little bit flippant about this. But if you get into like South American shamanism, for example, or you read the conversion stories of people coming out of, like, the real religious, real spiritual elements and aspects of this, is that's part of the facade, is that you think you're in control of the spirits, when in fact they're tricking you into thinking you're in control in order that they have control of you. Like, that's the whole game, even of the actual ones. My brother Ben was joking about something he was listening online of. Somebody's like, oh yeah, I'm going to this, like, witches convention or, shaman convention in Philadelphia. And he's like, Philadelphia, he's like, those are all JV witches. He's like, you got to go to South America to get the varsity ones.
That's true.
But it feels like that to me, of like,
Yeah.
there is like a junior varsity version of that neo-paganism is trying to be, that kind of mimics and to some degree desacralizes the really rich, intense forms of spiritual interaction that people have with the dark forces and spirits of the world that end up in bondage. I mean, my dad was born in Ecuador. My grandparents were missionaries down there. Becoming a Christian and recognizing that the spirits no longer controlled your life, and you didn't have to sacrifice a massive portion of your food at night into the jungles for the spirits to be appeased so that you wouldn't be bitten by the wrong snake. I mean, the celebration of liberation that came from being under the protection of Christ in that context was phenomenal. It wasn't theoretical. It was the reality in which people lived. And so to take the severity of the power dynamic that's at play between the Holy Spirit and the other spirits of the world, and to trivialize them, on one hand, you either laugh or cry, I guess, is where I'm at on that.
Well, and it's worth pointing out, like you did, Nathan, that there are serious practices of paganism that remain to this day, particularly in underdeveloped regions where you have, I mean, the reality of the spiritual world is not a luxury. People they don't have the luxury of questioning it. They know it indisputably. They're held in bondage.
Let me challenge you, though.
Yeah, but they... Yeah.
So you use the phrase in the or underdeveloped world here, and I was slapped upside the head by a quote. I was reading Malcolm Muggeridge's The End of Christendom, and I don't have I'll butcher this quote, and he uses the word savage because he was writing like the 70s, but he said that the savage basically kneeling and worshiping before the painted rock is closer to reality, or is closer to understanding the realities of the universe than Einstein. And what he means by that is that Einstein was brilliant in his mathematical description of physical reality, but the person engaging in an actual spiritual engaging ritual had a broader perspective of the complex forces behind all that is. And so I don't know what you make of a quote like that, but that would be one where there's a sense in which
he's totally right. Yeah.
Has God not blinded? Like, where's the wise man? Where's the scholar? Has God not blinded? So the spirit, in a sense in which what we consider to be developed nations are probably the most spiritually stunted humans ever to walk on the planet.
Yes.
So you're at a deeper risk of having a malformed spiritual concept of reality living in a hyper affluent Western culture than somebody in another part of the world. And I think that's the tantalizing. That's why you get all the Wall Street guys and the musicians and everybody flying down to South America to do ayahuasca with the shaman in a hut for the weekend, is because there's that sense of there's a broader scope of reality that we can tap into that gives some color beyond the bleak, dusty, overly reductionistic concept of the world in which we've built for ourselves. So therein lies the allure. But I think it's interesting to think like who's more developed and who's more stunted, and we might be surprised when it comes to the spiritual world.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, who's more in touch with reality, the shaman in the rainforest or Seth Rogen?
What's normative?
There's no question about Yeah, right. There's no question about who is the more deluded of the two of them. That does not mean that the shaman isn't playing with incredibly dangerous, or that rather incredibly dangerous things aren't playing with him.
I would recommend in some ways, I think, The Spirit of the Rainforest. If anybody wants to push into that one,
I
think The Spirit of the Rainforest is a great,
absolutely
knock you upside the head look at religious conversion of shaman.
Yeah, get ready to have your categories challenged.
Right.
But I think one of the most probably just concise statements on the matter comes from Paul in Corinthians. I think it's in 1 Corinthians, where he basically says, I don't want you to go along with these pagan practices because you'll be offering your sacrifices to demons.
Yeah, I don't want you to be uninformed.
That's what's happening.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what's happening across the board. And it doesn't, and sincerity, by the way, is not, doesn't change the fact. I mean, so even if somebody is half-heartedly, in other words, going along with this is what Nathan was getting at, that's not neutral. Let's say somebody just plays around with a tarot card app or something. It's still, you are still offering your sacrifices in a sense to demons when you do that. That's what you're doing. So even if you think, oh, it's just an app, oh, it's, I keep it at arm's length, oh, I'm more of a hippie than
What does
anything.
Paul
No,
mean by giving the devil a
nope.
foothold? Yeah.
Right. So yeah, so it's not neutral, but again, back to the cynical side of things though, because we don't live in the rainforest. We don't have the benefit of living in the rainforest. I should say it like that. We have the disadvantage of living in a developed nation filled with affluence and comfort and ease, where we easily mistake ourselves for gods these days. Even though we keep getting huge reminders that we're not, we still keep falling into this delusion. So here, neo-paganism often looks like something that we customize for our own personality, and we can keep it at arm's length. And in that sense, Nathan, I think you are just right to say a lot of these people, yeah, this is what they'll say. Well, I am spiritual, but I'm not religious. I'm not part of dogma. I'm not part of some, institutional church. I don't subscribe to all that legalistic nonsense. I'm free floating and freewheeling in my spirituality, and but this is more of so this is a consumer type of spirituality.
So consumerism
it
is exactly what it is. Okay, Seth Rogen didn't build his bed or grow his own weed. I can guarantee you that. Right. I mean, so what?
Yeah.
So everything is being produced for him by somebody who does get out of bed and go to work. And that is the consumer. That's the temptation of consumerism, setting us to feel like we're gods, is that the rest of the world serves at our leisure. And then neo-paganism just goes a step farther by saying, and the spirits of the world serve at my leisure as well.
That's it. I mean, and I don't think that's particularly cynical. It might sound that way. I think it's more accurate when you actually examine what we're doing in practice, because the word pagan can make us think, oh no, something terrible and noble is taking place. No, something sad and trivial is actually taking place. So am I concerned about it? Yes, I am. But I think once again, we come to a place where we as Christians, this is not the answer to this is not to go and try to market Jesus to these people who have bought into this vision. We have to be honest about the complete and total antithesis that Christianity represents to this view of life. And we have to be honest about the intrusive nature of Christ himself. But again, we've said this in an earlier podcast, this is going to involve, I think cultural apologetics these days involves the exposing of idols, which is, by the way, what Nathan and I have just been engaged in doing. It's one thing to say, oh, we have these huge spiritual impulses and we see them as a tremendous opportunity, but it's another thing to say, yeah, but they're hollow and they're empty. They're not neutral because these people, sadly, they think they're playing games. They're actually serving demons, and they're going to find themselves in more and more bondage. And by the way, I know several people who are engaged in these practices, and Nathan, I know you do too. And I'm going to tell you, not surprisingly, their lives are completely chaotic. And there's nothing surprising about that to me at all. Their lives are just chaos. From the health, from their health to their family dynamics, chaos. I know enough people now to say there's a general rule of thumb there. Not even remotely surprising to me. But so my point here is that this is not it's fun and cool to point to spiritual impulses and yearnings.
And it's anti-institutional,
tough love to say
which is super
this stuff's right. Yes, but it's tough love to say this stuff is hollow. And not only will it not help you, it'll destroy your life. It already is destroying your life. Christ may be intrusive. He is intrusive. He may shatter your dreams of sitting around naked in bed, smoking weed and watching cartoons all day long with non-kids. But he's your maker. And if you want to know true life, and by the way, if you want the human race to continue to exist, and you don't want your culture to commit suicide, and you want people to visit you when you're dying, you might want to reconsider some of your life choices.
Well, tell us how you really feel, Cameron. Okay, so it seems to me, Cameron, that we're walking through here. I hope what is taking something with a deadly seriousness. I heard you saying that. At the same time, not being paranoid about it because we recognize the hollowness of it. And at the same time, I want to pitch in here. You've talked about the value of horror because it scares people in categories that they didn't think existed. Neo-paganism has a whole lot. There are a whole lot of Christians who went to a certain degree down that road and then got seriously scared and recognized that they needed a spiritual protection bigger than what they could conjure up on their own, and got way out of there in a hurry. And so it is another category where people are engaging with the spiritual world, and we as a church, there is an opportunity here, I think, to pick up the broken pieces on the other side of that, because there'll be people who are broken within the categories that the church has and the New Testament speaks to. You know what's shocking to me is that when you start thinking from a neo-pagan perspective as like a growing portion of our culture, and then you read the New Testament and you read the Gospels, the Gospels make more sense of ministering to a neo-pagan world than they do to a naturalistic, materialistically reductionistic world. And so
100%.
The culture in which the church formed was a legit pagan culture. And so the culture, the neo-pagan culture of our times, the church can legitimately minister to that as well. So it's like, come on in, boys, the water's fine. Like, we're getting back into the groove in which the church was born. And that's not to say that it was without difficulty, but it isn't an existential threat to Christ and his church. So I think I want to leave us with that, of be inspired and encouraged. Hey, yeah, you're going to see some stuff that's a little different. But if we look back into the deep bench of what the resources we have as Christians, we by far have wonderful resources in order to engage these issues and questions in our time. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.